welcome to the Mindful Mixer podcast. This is Francesco Portoso.
And I'm Janina Loureiro. We're part of the organizing team behind Mindful Mixer, a project that started in Luxembourg and brings people together for in-person events to explore meaningful topics that shape our lives, yet often go unspoken in everyday conversations.
We believe that making time to reflect can lead to greater self-awareness and understanding, and ultimately to personal and collective growth.
This podcast carries the spirit of Mindful Mixer beyond the events, offering thought-provoking discussions for anyone seeking reflection and fresh perspectives.
So, join us as we explore ideas that matter, challenge assumptions, and open space for deeper, more mindful conversations. Hello and welcome to this session of the Mindful Mixer podcast. Today we are talking about boundaries, and a definition we found for boundaries this one: the rules and decisions individuals use to protect themselves. Janina, why did we pick this topic?
Yes, we found that it was a common struggle, not just between the two of us, but in general with people in our lives, at work and so on. And it's really a very prevalent concept in our lives that we had to manage. So what we found is that even the realities of life nowadays create that difficulties. For example, now we have more remote work, so that kind of blends in the physical space of life and work, and it kind of blurs the line of where to make the switch between both.
We have found that many of us experience this difficulty in switching off once we are working from home and we finish work. We are still in the same environment, and that makes it difficult to feel this separation between work and life, right?
Yes. And even though people don't necessarily call it boundaries, we found that, even with something as common and simple as New Year's resolutions, it's when people kind of reset and they list their boundaries, what they want to see moving forward in terms of their relationship with others, their relationships with themselves. So it's really something that even if we don't necessarily call it boundaries in a day-to-day interaction, but they are very, very present.
Yeah, it's a topic that seemed to really impact everybody to different extent. We found this research, this survey that was talking about how, I think it was Americans, the majority of people that try to set New Year's resolution put actually the ability to set specific boundaries in life as New Year's resolution. It makes relevant this topic, like even if people maybe are not necessarily good in setting boundaries.
The intention is there.
The intention is there, so people believe it is important. And also we identified a number of studies that prove the benefits of boundaries, of setting healthy boundaries, how having boundaries support both mental health but also life satisfaction. There was specifically some focus on how having boundaries can reduce the levels of stress and also how can increase the life satisfaction. And that's why we picked this topic for our conversation at Mindful Mixer. We started the live event with an interactive question to try to understand what are the areas of life where people find it the hardest to set boundaries, and what did we find out?
Generally, there was very clear from the start some top categories that were very popular. So family was one of them, the boundaries with ourselves and the boundaries with work. Less in friendship and less in the online, which actually is quite curious as well. But in the conversations then, I understood a bit better why that is, and how, for example, in friendship, you tend to have the same kind of notion of emotional intelligence. And so with your friends, it's much easier to communicate rather than different generations in your family and so on.
I was almost, maybe I could say, relieved that I didn't see the online as being one of the top, because nowadays we often speak about the negative impact of being online and social media. And at least in this question where we were asking again, which one are the hardest areas where to set boundaries, people didn't put online as the top. So it means that at least here it's not as relevant as other areas. Okay.
So I think we started this conversation by trying to understand what were healthy boundaries, right? Like, what is this definition and how it has evolved over time? And I think the majority, from discussing between the groups and like afterwards also exchanging a bit in the takeaways section with everyone, is that we really came to the conclusion that knowing ourselves is key to establishing this healthy boundaries, because it's only by understanding our needs and our feelings towards what triggers us, what makes us feel at peace, that really helps us understand how to prioritize and how to get an objective view of reality. So not an emotional one that comes from our triggered self and our more emotional self that is more subjective.
Yeah, I guess that often we hear this recommendation of trying to be as objective as we can and try to understand that we all have this view of reality that it's not really matching reality. It's normally an interpretation that goes through our lens that we created through our experiences and education. And here it matters a lot because, how we set certain boundaries and how we react when people set boundaries can really impact a lot a relationship, for instance.
Exactly. But that's not really something that we're really taught to do, right?
Yeah, in my group, in the event, many of us were not aware of this concept until maybe after university time, and when somehow you either have problems in your life and you try to fix them and you realize that there is this concept, or you get to know this by some friends or some books or talk. So nobody's teaching us this in school, and this is the common discussion about, is our education optimized for the needs of our current society, or is there something we can improve? I would put this definitely in the list of things that should be taught in school. Additionally, one reflection that was relevant was the concept of time and how by setting boundaries we can become more owners of our time. And by becoming more owners of our time, we also feel more satisfied because we can really decide if we're spending our time in a way that is aligned with how we want. And eventually time is one of the most important things we have, specifically, how we are dedicating our attention. There was a strong relation between boundaries and time that was highlighted. At the same time, one of the questions that we had that triggered many reflection was this obvious relation with all the both internal and external pressures from, for instance, different cultures, the way we were educated, and right. How this shaped our understanding of setting and maintaining boundaries. So. Yes. How did, for instance, your group reacted to this question?
Yes, this is, I think, a key topic of any mindful mixer, right? Like, how do we incorporate everything that is cultural expectations, society biases, and so on? And this is no different. Boundaries are heavily, heavily shaped by cultural and societal expectations. And I think there was a two-way discussion going on about, the role of power dynamics, about, for example, someone in a corporate position and how that plays into the set dynamic between the two people, but also in a more cultural way, like past burden there might be or trauma among family members, but also in terms of societal structures, right? Like in terms of the way we have the expectations for men, for women, what each one of us has been taught is perhaps our responsibility, and maybe we are starting to challenge that narrative, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. These structures that are there, and we have to somehow adapt, or we find it difficult not to adapt. And there were two examples from two different individuals coming from, let's say, far away, not Europe. And there was a person from a former Soviet country and another one from another country more to the east. And they were mentioning how the culture that they grew up, like after living it, they realized they didn't enjoy it so much because there was specifically certain very judgmental behaviors by society that were, let's say, encouraged. There was a specific example of how often shame was used as a way to let a person understand that they crossed the boundary that society had put. It was just interesting to see, in certain situations, how strong these boundaries can be, and how, it's difficult to change such an environment where you're coming from when you were born there. And it's difficult to understand also that that's not the default and the standard way, unless you try a different environment. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that actually the boundaries were there. They were just not perhaps communicated in the most constructive way, either through shame or maybe even silence, I'm guessing.
There was this example of having extreme, let's say maybe reaction, extreme behaviors, being either very confrontational or the opposite, being very sensitive. But there was not this culture of expressing your boundary, and that's definitely a result of the culture of of a given country. There are cultures that are much more communicating explicitly, and others that instead of communicating something, take for granted that you understand what I mean.
Oh, I understand.
And that often happens with certain cultures. I remember there was this very interesting book called The Culture Map. We can add it then in show notes, which talks specifically about these topics, how sometimes it's difficult to interact, especially at work, with different cultures, because certain cultures, like maybe an American one, is very direct, very explicit. Let's say minimize the chances that the other person misunderstands you, and other cultures feel that sounds maybe a bit unnecessary and even stupid to say everything, because certain things we should take it for granted because we went through the same culture, and so we don't need to repeat everything.
Express
we don't need
everything.
to express everything. So yeah, I think that's highly related. But besides this, we had some examples of potential differences in how men and women are related to emotional intelligence, right?
Right, yes. I found it almost surprising to understand that in this day and age, we had a specific example in which we had a female engineer. And just the fact that I have to say female engineer already kind of sets the tone for this discussion. But basically, she was expressing her difficulty in asserting herself in a male-dominated field throughout her life, and how even in school, like in university, there was already even judgment from the teachers, coming to a teacher with a problem and having a response being like, this is why maybe women should not be in this field. And it really shed some light into how difficult it can be to assert yourself and put your boundaries in when society is going against you and you're literally changing the narrative of society.
Right. Yeah. We had a related example that someone mentioned of this experiment that was done with 4-year-old kids that were made drinking disgusting lemonade with a lot of salt, and how they tested the reaction first of the boys and then the girls. And the boys were being very explicit, oh, this sucks, it's disgusting. And when they actually asked this to the girls, there was one that said, oh, I like it, but maybe can I have water the next time? So not being so explicit. And this led us also to ask ourselves the usual question that often comes in this conversation, which is, are people like this because of biological differences, or is it about how they were educated? So, the usual nature versus nurture issue.
But now linking to this empathy point, I think that was one point that we touched as well on the discussions, is how do we balance being our true selves, but then also honoring our relationship with others and our own limits, and how do we use boundaries to help us strengthen relationships?
Yeah, we had a big conversation about the importance of communication, right?
Basically, we discussed a lot on how communication and alignment are key to a good relationship. No matter which relationship, here we're talking about work, ourselves, with others. And so by expressing our needs, that should not be seen as us being aggressive. That should be seen as us being assertive. So that's the general consensus that we had. And also how it helps us perceive and process the boundary better if we can understand why the person is setting this specific boundary, right? Like if we can put ourselves in their shoes and understand why they might put in place this boundary.
Yeah, basically you're saying that if you tell me that you want to set a boundary and you explain why, it's probably better in the communication rather than just setting the boundary, because if I understand the reason that is driving your decisions, then it's much more likely I will, maybe react better. And we have this question that was very related to this topic. We asked to people, when somebody sets a boundary with you, how do you usually feel? What did they say? Yeah.
It was quite surprising because we got a very unanimous response. So the top reactions were feeling rejected and feeling defensive. There was also some respondents said curious, which is, I think, a constructive way of seeing that as well.
I think this was, a good way to still see our instinct and how it's easy for us to feel defensive. So yeah, it sucks sometimes to hear a person that wants to set a boundary with us. So we put this question specifically because we wanted to make sure that each of us can also feel the other side, right? And,
exactly.
But at the same time, there was also this interesting inputs about the benefit of listening. What is the boundary of the other person? Because if I know what is your boundary, then our relationship becomes simpler, right? Exactly. I know what is your limit, basically.
Yeah, you don't have to guess.
Yeah, I don't have to guess, so it makes it simpler. That was another benefit to keep in mind.
Exactly. So here we also went into understanding when a boundary has been crossed or when one is needed. Because before we're talking about how we might practice saying no more and so on, but how do we understand ourselves that we might need to realign our boundaries and readjust?
Yeah, that's not an easy question. But again, when somebody crosses our boundary, what do? You can either decide that it's not worthy, maybe explaining again the boundary, or maybe even mentioning it at all because maybe it's a temporary situation, and then you can decide to somehow play the game and just understand it's something temporary and avoid the negative reaction on your side by just one could say acting. Or in certain situations where you can see that you're very impacted by the person not respecting your boundary, then you can potentially cut the relationship. There is not many other way around, I guess. Yeah.
Here, what you're trying to say is that really we are being guided by how much impact does this have in our lives, right? We might entertain our boundaries being crossed if the impact in our lives is minimal.
Yeah, exactly. Also because realistically, it's not that every time we meet a person we can communicate all the boundaries. It will sound very awkward if I meet you and then
here's my list.
Yeah, here's a list of boundaries. But at the same time, we came to this conclusion that there is a common pattern among most of us mentioning parents as an area with, let's say, as a group of people, let's say, with whom it's difficult to set boundaries, because parents tend to kind of see their kids always a bit in the same way, not really growing. And so there are situations where, you can set boundary or you can cut the relationship, and there are other situations where maybe you want to cut relationship with your parents and maybe you kind of end up playing the game, because you care about the relationship.
And this just adds to the complexity of setting boundaries, because it's really something that we delved on later on about how setting boundaries can make us feel guilty or hesitant, and how do we manage that, right?
Yeah, we mentioned that guilt or fear of conflict, the interest in please people and worrying about their reactions. These are all possibly synonyms of us wanting to avoid conflict with a person, and how often this is maybe blocking us from setting boundaries.
But it was interesting to see that it's actually natural for us to feel this when setting boundaries, because it's just a natural human reaction, right? We are almost going from this premise that we are all well-intentioned and we all want to have positive influence in the world. For us to set boundaries is almost a barrier to that. And what we saw is that it was actually something that we needed to accept in order to create this more positive relationships, right?
Absolutely. One way to often go through these negative feelings is the awareness first. So the awareness that, okay, that's what we feel guilty, and understanding that it's normal, it's part of our human nature. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily bring us the best results with the current society. Again, we have to remember that our feelings developed in an environment thousands of years ago, where we had very different needs and very different opportunities, and they're an indicator of something, but they don't necessarily need a specific reaction that we maybe would have if we follow our instinct. And the acceptance of this understanding that, it's not easy to set boundaries, and it's a difficult process. At the same time, it can be simple, because it can be just communicating, sharing a specific sentence with a person, or just remembering to ourselves, if it's a boundary with ourselves. That could be really the key for a fulfilling relationship. And another concept that often comes when we have this discussion, it's this struggle between long-term benefit and short-term gratification. And also here, you can see how not setting a boundary makes us feel better, because we don't have to have this conflict in the short term with a person, and so it's obviously easier to do that. But then in the long term, we would have difficult consequences, or we wouldn't have the results that we would like to have. So this challenge of having maybe uncomfortable conversation in the short term would actually bring us long-term benefits of having the relationship we would like to have.
Yeah, that really ties up with one of our later questions, which was focused on our own boundaries, right? Like the connection with time for ourselves, need for rest, whether we overcommit, whether we engage in negative self-talk.
I remember we agreed to have this specific question because often we forget how some of the most important boundaries might be exactly those with ourselves, because we can postpone them, we can just not be aware of them. And an example we had, I remember acknowledging this myself. Many people have this issue of having to be productive all the time and feel bad if you are not, and how this is really something that you have good intention, but at the same time you cannot be productive all the time, and it's okay, and that's also natural. So we were trying to understand how we can avoid this, and one solution that often is proposed in this situation is to try to reserve specific time for not being productive, because otherwise what happens often is that maybe you get distracted when you should be productive, and then you feel very bad, and then you enter in this negative loop. It's good to be productive, and it's good to enjoy your deserved time of rest by planning it. You had some other interesting example, I think.
Yes, it was really interesting to see that the relationship with certain boundaries that in terms of limiting our behaviors, right? So we had this dual approach in which some participants had trouble limiting or having boundaries with food, and the other side of participants had more trouble creating boundaries around drinking. So it was interesting to see that dynamic, because as someone who usually is more oriented towards food, it never even crossed my mind this other perspective. Okay,
yeah, that's definitely one of the personal boundaries that many of us struggle in different situations to respect. But to wrap up, we always like to try to provide some food for thoughts, to maybe have a call to action. And we had a question about this as well, right?
Our question was, what is this small shift that we can make this week to protect our time, our energy, our values?
We had some personal tasks that people mentioned. One of these recommendation was that besides setting a boundary, often useful to question why we would like a specific boundary, just in case, trying to make sure that we set the right boundary. But why do we want such boundary? Is it really aligned with the person I want to be? Because sometimes maybe we just want to set a boundary that it's not really useful for us, but somehow we believe that's a boundary. So question our boundaries could be useful for sure.
More critical thinking.
And then also in relationship with others, try to understand, to focus more on the intention of the person. Maybe the person is crossing the boundary, but has good intentions. So try to maybe focus more on intention to avoid some unnecessary, drama or disappointment. So these were a couple of concepts that we had in our discussion.
To kind of link to that, I think it's interesting to bring here this notion that in the end we are all imperfect and like we are doing our best, but we also should stay flexible with us, with ourselves, with other people, because we are all learning and we're all trying to get better. So that was an interesting point that kind of ties up with one takeaway that we had from the wider group, which I will literally quote because I think it's really amazing. Boundaries will be a struggle for your entire life. Keep an eye on them.
Yes.
I think that's a very insightful way to finish this podcast.
Well, yeah, I think it is a piece of wisdom that reconnects with this concept of acceptance that we were discussing. So I think if we can share like last food for thoughts invitation for the people that will listen to this, remember we are all in all of this together, and let's try to think if we have the right boundaries, and if not, understanding which one we would like to have, and how can we let others and ourselves understand them in the best way.
Exactly. Thank you a lot for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
See you next time.
See you in the next session.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Mindful Mixer. Thanks so much for tuning in.
If you enjoyed the conversation, you can support the project by sharing it with a friend who might find it interesting, and you can follow us on social media for updates on new episodes and events.
Mindful Mixer is on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, but the best way to stay up to date with our events is to subscribe to our mailing list. Just check the links in the show notes.
There, you'll also find any references to materials we might have mentioned during the session. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode.